So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Vittorio Gallese, who is, as you know, one of the discoverers of mirror neurons. He's part of the Parma group and professor of psychobiology at the University of Parma. He has made incredible contributions to our understanding of the science of empathy. And I would also like to introduce David Romand, who is a philosopher who has studied in Parma, but is currently associate researcher at the Centre Gilles-Gaston Granger, Maison de la Recherche in Aix-Marseille University. So we're eager to hear your talk, both of you. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So it's a double presentation, 10 minutes for me and then 10 minutes for Vittorio. So the title of our double presentation is Literary Empathy, a Neurophenomenological Approach. Well, I will begin with a short paragraph on empathy and language, revisiting Lipps' legacy. One way of clarifying the polysemous notion of empathy is to turn back to the issue as it was systematically addressed for the first time by Theodor Lipps at the beginning of the 20th century. As canonically defined by Lipps, empathy refers to one's capacity to project one's own affective ego or ego's feeling onto the constituent elements of the perceived or imagined environment. Empathy has to do with the individual's capacity to feel alive in the object he or she perceived as existing outside of him or her, and to apprehend them as a kind of reflection of his or her own inwardness. Lipps commonly says empathy to be one's self-objectivations in the sensory phenomena one perceives or imagines. Here, the German terms. In his writings, Lipps recurrently associates empathetic experience with the phenomenon of ensoulment, vitalization, loveliness, anthropomorphization, self-activity. Here we're dealing with a number of experience of states whose common point in the apprehension of an extra-personal form of subjectivity. When empathizing with somebody or something, one experiences one's feeling of oneself as externalized in an entity or in an event distinct from one's own body, that is, as a subjective property inherent to a definite constituent element of the objective world. In Lipps, this phenomenological conception of empathy goes hand in hand with a broad way of envisioning from the functional point of view, from envisioning empathy from a functional point of view. For Lipps, empathy is an ubiquitous, cross-modal, and cross-domain activity involved in all manifestations of psychological life relating to the extra-personal experience of subjectivity. Lipps was also the very first to systematically address the question of how empathetic activity is involved in language processes. In his major writings, empathy appears as a both ubiquitous and pivotal dimension of the experience of language. Among the manifold implications of the empathetic function discussed by Lipps, I won't comment on them here. Two prove to be of particular theoretical importance. Two forms of linguistic empathy, which I refer to as enunciative empathy and narrative empathy. Let us begin with saying a word about enunciative empathy. Lipps identifies a kind of empathy by which means, he explains, we inwardly participate in the utterance of words and sentences, whether heard or pronounced by us, and whose function is to allow us to consciously communicate with all the speaking subjects. According to him, linguistic comprehension is basically an empathy-mediated phenomenon. We cannot understand words and sentences without being aware of the fact that the meaning is experientially shared by another individual with whom we are currently communicating. Insofar as it makes both speaker and hearer aware of having a shared linguistic experience, empathy proves to be indispensable for intercomprehension. Here we are dealing with a kind of empathy that can be said to be enunciative because it consists of construing statements or utterances as originating from or as being addressed to another individual. Sorry. Narrative empathy, for its part, is a concept to which Lipps devotes a whole chapter of his Aesthetics, first volume, published in 1903. This form of empathy has to do with, quote, the fact of communicating single or general facts or thought contents, end quote, regardless the formal linguistic components that serve to express them. Here, in other words, we are dealing with an empathy for narrative, Bericht in German. Here, mutatis mutandis, we are dealing with what current theorists call narrative empathy. Each of the two concepts should be clarified, enunciative empathy and narrative empathy. Enunciative empathy can be defined as a dimension of linguistic empathy that allows one to subjectively take part in a process of communication of a statement or an utterance by allowing one to establish an experiential link between oneself and another speaking subject. This kind of empathy specifically relates to the act of enunciation. By contrast, narrative empathy is a dimension of linguistic empathy through which one experiences subjective phenomena and social relations within the fictional environment induced by one's apprehension of meaningful statements. We are dealing with a kind of empathy that characteristically relates to the contents of enunciation. So my second point now, the narratological function of empathy, a tentative typology of narrative empathetic processes. One's capacity to empathize with language processes can be generically referred to as linguistic empathy or empathy for language. Aesthetic linguistic empathy or aesthetic empathy for language, for its part, refers to all the manifestations of the empathetic function involved in the aesthetic experience of language, whatever it may be. Aesthetic linguistic empathy is not restricted to literature, but concerns other artistic forms as well, like cinema. Moreover, it doesn't necessarily relate to aesthetic properties inherent to literary text, but has also to do with aesthetic property external to them, for instance, the fact of appraising the rendering of speech or a play. The dimension of aesthetic linguistic empathy, specifically involved in the appreciation of literary language, correspond to literary empathy. The expression narrative empathy is often taken as a synonym of literary empathy, a view that, according to me, is misleading. On the one hand, narrative empathy is far from boiling down to literary language. As I stated earlier, this is an essential component of ordinary linguistic consciousness. On the other hand, considered from the aesthetic point of view, narrative empathy has a more restrictive meaning than literary empathy. It specifically relates to the fictional contents induced by literary statements, that is, to narratological properties. By contrast, although it has largely to do with narratological properties, literary empathy relates to further aesthetic linguistic phenomena, such as rhetorical devices, and so with stylistics. Here, I will focus on the issue of literary narrative empathy by showing that it is involved in at least 4 kinds of narratological processes. First, empathy for characters. As a constituent elements of a fictional world, characters are more or less individualized entities whom, as reader or hearers, audience members, we empathize with, and we experience as animated and living beings while attributing them intentions, thoughts, and deeds. Empathy for characters appeals to theory of mind, participation in others' emotional states, experience of agency, etc. Second form of aesthetic narrative empathy, perspectival empathy. In narratology, perspective or point of view refers to, quote, the way the representation of the story is influenced by the position, personality, and values of a narrator, the characters, and possibly other more hypothetical entities in the story world, end quote. Quote by Niederhoff. Here we're dealing with a narratological property that has to do, par excellence, with empathetic activity, and I propose to call perspectival empathy the form of narrative empathy that is specifically involved in the effect of subjectivity that structure and modulate literary discourse. Not only does perspectival empathy relate to the fact of envisioning discourse from the internal point of view, such as direct speech, first-person narrative, or interior monologue, but also to discursive modes in which the expression of subjectivity is more ambiguous, such as free indirect speech or psychonarration. Third time, I distinguish dialogic empathy. I call dialogic empathy the form of empathy that specifically relates to the readers, hearers, audience members' capacity to subjectively participate in the dialogues between fictional characters, in the relationship between narrator and narratee, and more generally speaking, in all communicational processes that one may experience when being immersed in the literary piece of work. Insofar as it allows one to be aware of the interactions between the two or more speaking subjects, dialogic empathy is by definition a form of enunciative empathy. It has nonetheless to do with narrative empathy, since in that case, dialogic processes belong to the narrative content itself. Dialogic empathy can be defined as the particular form of enunciative empathy that, because it occurs within the fictional world one is immersed in, turns out to be a particular instance of narrative empathy. And fourth type, mood empathy. An expression and a concept coined by Lipps, mood empathy, Stimmungseinfühlung, can be defined as the atmospheric way of empathizing by which what we empathize with produces on us a global subjective impression. Literary mood empathy has to do par excellence with one's power of subjectivation of an imagined mental scene without our feeling of subjectivity being referred to a definite character or object. Importantly, not all kinds of literary mood experience can be said to be empathetic. For instance, a literary device like defamiliarization or derealization typically induces a state of mood in which we have the feeling of alienness, uncanniness, surprise, uneasiness, etc., and that don't have directly to do with the extra-personal experience of subjectivity and then empathy. So it's the end of my part, and I hand over Vittorio.
Thank you so much, David. I feel embarrassed, a little embarrassed after this incredibly sophisticated and illuminating dissection of empathy, to welcome you to reductionism. Hopefully only a methodological one. I will drag you downstairs to the cellar where the nuts and bolts likely originating all this interesting way to formalize our relation to language and narrative are generated. Exactly 20 years ago, I proposed that interpersonal relations depend at the basic level on the constitution of a shared manifold space, as reminded kindly by several talks during this webinar. And this shared space is functionally characterized by embodied simulation routines, which means that sensory motor and affective bodily states and the reuse of their underpinning neural mechanism not only provide architecture enabling to live in the world, so to speak, but also to imagine the world and to inhabit the parallel worlds of cultural artifacts, like when reading a novel, watching a movie, etc., and to empathize with their content. But this is a very important clarification, I think. Reuse is always partial. And this, in my view, allows the distinction between self and other, granting the otherness of the other so many phenomenologists are rightly concerned with. The self, however, remains the principal benchmark to understand others, be they real or fictional. Others both real and fictional, in turn, plastically model the self, which isn't an object, but a word designating a dynamic process. So there is always a chiasmatic relationship between our attitude towards the real or the fictional world and the world, the real world and the fictional world affect us in return. Cultural artifacts and the consequent social practices they determine emerge from implicit knowledge, which is the complex set of behavioral paradigms that individuals perform, imagine, and internalize mimetically due to the constant interpersonal relationship occurring in specific environment, starting within the womb, to side with Siri. In our 2011 essay, How Stories Make Us Feel, Anna and I focus on narrative empathy and the mirror neural mechanism that we proposed as a key aspect of embodied simulation, the activation of the brain body during the reading or viewing of fictional narratives. When we navigate the parallel world of fictional narrative, we basically rely on the same brain-body resources shaped by our relation to mundane reality. And these resources provide the functional scaffold and the building blocks that our engagement with fictional characters rearranges by means of different forms of framing. So these different forms of framing, of course, affect the way these mechanisms are running and are underpinning our appreciation of, for example, of fiction. Reading mobilizes our capacities for empathic co-feeling with others, a co-feeling that registers within our own bodies. As readers, we make sense of complex narrative also by relying on few textual or discourse cues. And these cues, which fiction creatively reconfigures, are the expression of social habits, social practices that readers recognize because they literally constitute the fabric of readers' lives. So let me just, in a pill, address a topic that recurred during our discussion. Are there quasi-emotion? The case of the embodiment of emotion is in particular, as it often reveals that simulation of others' emotional experience, particularly when very intense, can easily give way to emotional contagion and reenactment. When engaged with fictional characters, we can be so emotionally involved as to be moved to tears. The tears we weep when we are moved by a fictional narrative clearly are not quasi-tears. Similarly, the strong feelings of anguish and compassion for characters we experience when reading their fictional misgivings and misadventures are not quasi-emotion, as they are less real than those we experience when engaged with real others. They can, in fact, sometimes be much stronger, as I said. This phenomenal quality is accompanied by the activation of part. This is essential to be underlined. Only part of the same brain circuits that underpin our real life experiences. Let me briefly tap on mind reading and fictional characters. I don't have time to dissect this notion, which I don't really like. I don't think we read minds, but that's for another occasion. I want to briefly show you these empirical results by Broom and colleagues, who studied whether identification with fictional characters, the protagonist of the Game of Thrones, is associated with increased neural overlap between the brain mapping of self and others, be they real or fictional. So basically, participants were asked to rate on a Likert scale some attribute, being pessimistic, being moody, that could be variously attributed to themselves, to close acquaintances, or to fictional characters like Jon Snow, one of the lead characters of the Game of Thrones. And the results are quite interesting because they show that a larger response for the self than for friends and fictional others in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. a brain region normally activated when thinking about the self or close others. Another set of brain areas that collectively are being defined as the default mode network, implicated both in self-referential and social cognition, and a supposedly mind-reading related area, the temporal-parietal junction, responded more strongly to the self than to close friends and fictional characters. However, and here comes an interesting result, self and others, both real and fictional ones, activate overlapping brain networks with different intensities, the strongest being related to the self. But if you plot the intensity of the difference of the activation of this part of the brain for the self or for others in relation to the strength of your trait identification with a fictional character, it turns out that neural responses for self and fictional characters are more similar, which means this difference between self and other gets progressively reduced among individuals who regularly mentally simulate narrative experience from the first person psychological perspective of characters within the story. These findings suggest that the more immersed people tend to get in experiencing experiences of becoming a fictional character, the more likely they are to access knowledge about that identity using the same neural machinery as they do to access knowledge about themselves. So there is always this self-related benchmarking. I'm about to finish. None of our experiences is ever direct, as they are all mediated by our relational body. Our engagement with fictional characters is cognitively and bodily premediated, to use a notion proposed a few years ago by Richard Grusing, by our life engagement, which provides the basic framing to navigate the world of fiction. But on the other hand, fiction in turn premediates life experience, as our engagement and identification with fictional characters provide clues and perspective that can affect how we cope with life's challenges, which is what we imply when we designate art as a life changer. Engaging with other experiences, be they real or fictional, also enables a deeper understanding of ourselves. The intercorporeality implied by embodied simulation constitutes a useful starting point to analyze the mode of presence that characterizes fiction and to shed new light, we hope, on our responses to it through its mediation. But I don't want to finish with some level of pessimism, but this is a kind of self-reminder of humility when we are dealing with these complex issues, and the complexity of the issues we are discussing yesterday and today perfectly transpired from the nice talk given by David. However, it might be very difficult, if not impossible, to reduce all the useful conceptual distinction employed to define literary empathy into distinct brain function, as the subtle language-mediated conceptual distinctions we are capable of can hardly be translated in a one-to-one fashion into specific neural mechanism. And I want to have Robert Musil to come to my aid. Here is a quote from Emotion Psychology, that big chunk of pages which are designated normally as emotion psychology, published posthumously after 1938. Begin quote, "In truth, according to this view, the pure nature of the emotion, of the idea, of sensation, and of the will are as little to be met with in the internal world as are thread of a current or a difficult point in the outer world." Thank you so much for your attention.